Prison Days, Book 8. Written by Simon King. Narrated by Todd Waites. Introduction. Book 8. Wow. I'm still in total awe about how these books have made it this far. Even more surprising is that you were still beside me for another go-around. Do you have a history with prisons yourself? Perhaps you had a father who worked at one, or a brother or sister. Perhaps you worked in one yourself and feel like a return to the kind of crazy atmosphere you've come to call normal. Normal? Okay, maybe not that far, but you know what I mean. Or perhaps you even served time in jail, a first-hand witness to some of the antics that happen on a daily basis. Whatever it may be, I'd love to hear from you. As much as I love telling these stories, I also love hearing them from across the world. I once sent an email to Piper Kerman herself, hoping to connect with the woman responsible for the whole orange is the new black addiction everyone suffered a few years ago. But I never received a reply. It didn't upset me. For some, distancing themselves from these hellholes is a natural response. It's like breaking free from a destructive relationship and grabbing that first bit of fresh air as you slam the door behind you. You know what I'm talking about, yeah? Anyway, I recently announced that I would be releasing books 8, 9, and 10 to finish off the series, and then pursue something else. I know that those who followed my prison books love anything nonfiction, and there's a story I've been carrying with me for a very long time that I'm desperate to share. Actually, to be honest, that particular story is still playing out in some ways, and I sometimes wonder whether the events will ever truly end. You see, the story is about me and a heartbreaking event that rocked my family's world back in 2013. Some of us never recovered, whilst those that did still bear the scars, carrying the painful memories through each and every day. It's the story of a child who was preyed upon by a sexual predator and left with horrific scars that I doubt will ever be truly healed. It's about a disgusting decision the perpetrator made that ensured the child could never escape the harm she had caused, not only on the child, but also on countless family members, friends, and law enforcement officials. This story began long before I published my first ever book, but has continued to evolve into something that I plan to release this year. It will be a revelation to the world that I think needs to be told, and despite the pain and anguish it has caused, will be turned into something positive. It needs to be turned into something positive, because there's a little human whose life is still playing out through all this, a little girl who never asked for any of it. It is for her that I will write this book, to ensure that she has a little something for her future. To accomplish this, I will be asking for your help in the coming weeks, so that we can spread her message far and wide that it's never okay to hurt a child. If you haven't subscribed to my website yet, please do, as I will be sending updates in the next few weeks on a book that I know will grip you from the very beginning and make you scream out in anger. But for now, it's prison stories you came for, and prison stories you shall receive. Because there's always something happening inside maximum security. Don't you know that? Tuesday, January 1st. I have high hopes as I walk through the main airlock, greet a few officers coming the other way, and grab my keys and radio. It is, after all, the first day of a brand new year, and despite all that had happened during the previous year, I'm hopeful that maybe this one will turn into something more positive. Things can change in prison as well, can't they? Ricky gives me a hug as I pass her walking through the long walkway up to the first gate into the movement control, and she tells me the day has been pretty quiet. That's a good sign and something to give me hope. If the day had been quiet, hopefully the night would follow suit. I make my way to the duty supervisor's office, find Gary Tannen sitting in the prime seat, and wish him a Happy New Year. After the standard handshakes, fist bumps, and howdies to a couple of other officers standing in the office, he hands me the night shift roster. Gary is one of the easier-going supervisors, treating his crew with the respect he'd expect himself. He's one of those guys that treats officers like grown-ups, the way it should. Some who run the show love to treat people like children, needing to micromanage the entire shift to give themselves some kind of kick. Perhaps they just want to ensure that nothing happens by dictating everything that goes on. The sheet isn't filled out, and the night shift crew who have been allocated to patrol shifts can choose their own unit groups to look after. Being the first officer to turn up, I have the honor of having the entire prison open to me, able to choose whatever I wish. The funny thing is, it's not a simple decision, because there's a few things to consider when choosing the unit groups. You see, it's not just searching that we need to perform throughout the night. For one thing, we are responsible for everything that goes on in the units themselves. These include buzz-ups, after-hours medical escorts, any possible medical issues, post-lockdown court returns that need escorting back to the units, any after-hours transfers that could come in, plus, of course, early morning medical escorts and court attendees that need to be woken and brought up to admissions. As you can see, that's a lot to consider. Plus, there's one other thing to consider, and it's the one point that can make or break your entire shift: your offsider. Which officer will look at the sheet and select the units you've chosen for yourself? A lot of the time, officers will select their own units which they already work in. Not everybody on night shift is a night shift officer. Most are day shift officers that are required to perform a stretch of nights every few weeks. It's just a part of their own roster. So instead of selecting some random units, they choose their own, which gives them a reason to go and spend time in the unit once all the work is done. They spend time in their own unit because night shift is the perfect opportunity to catch up with some of the duties they may be behind in with their day job. A large part of being a unit officer involves prisoner interaction, and these interactions must be documented in a very specific way in the prisoner's personal file. It's those very notes that can have a huge impact on a prisoner's sentence. If a crook has been engaging with an officer, has taken the suggestion from officers to maybe take on a specific course, possibly even gain some sort of a qualification, then the note will be added to his file. That file could be presented to the parole board at the proper time and have an impact on the parole board's ultimate decision. Some prisoners take this very seriously, although not all do, which is why a lot of officers will spend the time catching up with their prisoner files during night shifts. It makes for the perfect night and also helps with passing the time. Whenever I get given the choice of which units to look after, I always tend to select the protection units. Yes, they can be a lot more painful to deal with, and yes, they do tend to have more medical escorts than any other. But for one thing, a couple of their units are the cleanest in the jail. No disgusting smells, no overflowing bins, just a building with a bunch of bedrooms inside. I try to think back to the roster to remember which officers were working tonight. There's a couple of names I'd rather avoid working with, and I know one of them works in Yara South. Ah, fuck it, I whisper to myself as I write my name next to the block of units that includes Yara North and South, plus Loddon North. I decide to take my chances, scribble my name down, then give a final wave before heading off to the staff room. It's still a little early, and as I exit back into the sunshine, I actually begin to whistle. The staff room is mostly deserted, with just 2 people watching television as I walk in. They both turn, wave, and return to their show. Some old MASH episode. I dump my bag, grab my food, and go and throw it in the fridge. It's a lovely day outside, and rather than sit and wait inside, I head back out to the segregated sitting area, where a few tables and chairs have been set up for officers to relax. A high, cafe-style timber fence runs along one entire side of the area, and I grab a seat almost beside it. I drop into a chair, let myself slump back, and close my eyes, letting the prison sounds drift to me as I enjoy a few minutes of peace before the inevitable storm that is night shift. I hear prisoners walking back and forth in the adjoining yard. From the sounds of it, one is telling the rest about the latest Spider-Man movie, and from what I can hear, is getting quite excited by the concept of getting out to make it the first fucking thing I'll do. "Hey, stranger," a voice suddenly says much closer than expected, and I open my eyes to see Thelma standing by the staff room door. "Hey, yourself," I reply. "You and me." I didn't remember seeing Thelma's name on the roster, and she must have seen me trying to work it out. "Got called in for overtime." I shoot her a wink, then watch as she heads inside. She returns to my spot a few moments later, and we chat about the kinds of things colleagues normally talk about. Who's done what, who's left, who's been kicked out, normal prison officers talk. We barely pay the radio any attention when Control calls for movement to cease in anticipation of final lockdown. It's only when Control calls count correct about 15 minutes later that we finally get up and make our way to Yarra North. It's a public holiday, which means there's no court arrivals, no transfers, and basically nothing exciting going on. That means we can head straight to our units and begin our searches. We barely make it into the unit when the radio fires up and calls for Patrol 2. It's my call sign for the night, and I respond immediately. When the officer asks me to phone at my earliest convenience, I already know what the subsequent request will be. "Yo," I speak into the phone when Joe answers. "Simon, can you and Thelma head to South and grab Luckman from 22 and take him to medical, please? He missed meds." "No probs," I reply, and see Thelma's shoulders drop as I nod, acknowledging what she already mouthed at me. We head next door, and while Thelma heads to the officer station to fill out Luckman in the unit log, I head to his cell. Thelma needs to enter him leaving the unit, in case there's an emergency while he's in our care. I give a slight tap on the cell door, then unlock the trap. Before lowering it, I step a little to one side, just in case he's standing behind the door with a weapon, hot water, or a shit bomb ready to launch. He has neither, simply sitting on the edge of the bed staring back at me. "Need meds?" I ask, and he nods. "Cool. Got your ID?" He nods again and holds his ID card up for me. "All right, come and stick your hands through. Gotta put bracelets on." "Why do you need to cuff me?" Whilst his tone isn't friendly, I can tell he's not asking in order to kick off. I don't recognize him and figure he might just be new. "Rules. It's after lockdown." He doesn't seem to disagree with my answer and puts his hands through. I snap the handcuffs onto his wrists, lock them in place, then close the trap again. Thelma is just finishing her log entry as I unlock the cell and let Luckman out onto the tier. Moments later, the three of us head out through the airlock. Medical is deserted when we arrive, and as I get Luckman to stand by the nurse's window and wait, Thelma heads down the corridor to find someone on duty. Normally, someone would already be waiting, but due to the public holiday, things tend to go a little more relaxed. Thelma returns a few moments later, a male nurse following close behind. He's a small Indian man named Tim and is one of those people that likes to let crooks know they're crooks. In other words, he denies them everything, if possible. "Hey," Luckman says as the nurse appears in the window. Tim ignores his greeting and holds his hand out, as if expecting Luckman to read his mind. "ID card," he finally snaps in a demanding tone. "What's up your arse?" Luckman asked, still admirably calm. "Don't swear at me," Tim responds with his thick accent. "Swear at you?" Luckman looks at Thelma and I, raising his shoulders as if questioning. Neither of us react. We can't. The only thing we can do is interrupt if he starts being a dick or attempts to break something. He drops the card on the counter and slides it through the small opening in the perspex. Tim picks it up, with both men's eyes remaining locked on each other. I groan, wishing I could tell the nurse to pull his head in. But I can't. "Can we get going?" Thelma suddenly asks, and inside, I laugh a little. She's never been one to keep quiet, and it's one of the reasons I love working with her. We've got other things to do, you know? Tim looks at Thelma with the color already rising in his cheeks, offers her an apologetic wave, and turns to go through the medication drawers, each one holding prisoners' medication folders. When he finds Luckman's, he simply dispenses the pills into a small cup and pushes them, plus his ID card, back through the slot. The crook grabs a drink cup from the dispenser hanging on the wall, fills it with water, and upends the pills into his mouth as Tim disappears back into his room. I check Luckman's mouth to ensure he swallowed the pills, then direct him back to the door. We barely make it back to the unit when Control again calls me on the radio again. "Fucking hell," Thelma mutters. It turns out to be someone just wanting their lights switched off in Yara South. Once I lock Luckman back into a cell, I comply with the second request, then return to where Thelma is just finishing up her bit. "May as well start searching here," I offer, and she nods in agreement. Thelma takes the top tier in kitchen, while I roam the common area, laundry, and fridges. In one, I find 2 bottles of homemade brew, both hidden inside a rubbish bag that someone's tried to hide beneath a load of washing inside a washing machine. I simply grab them and empty the liquid down the drain, trying to hold my nose as the rank-smelling orange syrup disappears. I know it's not the kind of start you were hoping for, but for us, it was one of the better shifts, especially being the first of the year. The rest of the shift went by without a hitch, and our searching yielded no other finds. One of the other teams found a significant shiv hidden inside a milk container, but that was about all. The morning only saw a single prisoner being transferred to court, and he didn't come from our unit, so that meant we sat in the staff room for almost 8 hours, and I doubt you want to hear the details of that. By the time I walked back out into the real world, the sun was blazing down. Thelma waved me off, and as I hopped into my car, reminded myself that I would be back before the sun had set again. Wednesday, January 2nd. Night shift has always felt weird to me, because it feels as if you return to work the same day that you already finished. Yes, I know you actually do, and have a sleep in between, but it still carries a strange sensation to it. Once back inside and rounding the corner of the duty supervisor's office, I'm happy to see that Gary Tannen is back in the driver's seat. I gladly take the sheet he hands me, repeat the process with my name as a brief hint of déjà vu hits me, and return to the staff room just as I had the previous night. Before I know it, I'm back sitting where I was the previous evening and smile to myself as I close my eyes. For the briefest of moments, I wonder whether Thelma will shortly come around the corner and we have another easy shift. But that wish quickly disappears as good old Tony Malone suddenly appears out of the corner of my eye. He doesn't see me and disappears through the door, but it's enough for me to get a sinking feeling way down in the pit of my stomach. Why is it that every time you think the worst outcome possible, it has a way of materializing into reality? As he walks back out a few minutes later, Tony spots me sitting near the wall and grins. The kind of grin that tells me everything without words. "Me and you," he yells over his shoulder as he disappears down the corridor again. "You and I, fuckstick," I whisper to myself. This was definitely not the night I was expecting. The day staff have barely made it out of the prison by the time the first code is called by Control. Tony and I had just locked our only late court return into a cell, and we immediately head out the door to attend. It was a code Mike in Murray North, and as we neared the unit a few minutes later, heard the usual yelling between the units. Once inside, the noise seemed to increase with more prisoners shouting at each other, A couple of officers were already standing before a familiar cell, and when one of them mouthed the name Toby at me, I understood what was happening. Gary arrived not long after me and immediately went to the trap. The smell must have hit him straight away, because as soon as he peered inside, he pulled his head back, slammed the trap shut, and began to wave the air away from his face. "Prick's covered in it," he tried to say, but just as he began to speak, the banging on the door began as Toby repeatedly kicked it. The echo reverberated around the unit, and a few of the crooks began to bang their own doors, screaming for the retard to shut the fuck up. "You guys can go," Gary called to where 4 of us were standing. "We don't need everyone." None of us needed to be asked twice. Toby Manning had bronzed up, and the last thing we wanted was his shit stuck in our noses for the rest of the night. He was good at bronzing up, painting himself and the walls of his cell with whatever excrement he could conjure up out of his butthole. It felt good to head back out into the fresh air, and soon the noise of the unit faded out behind us. Tony and I returned back to Yarra North and began our search in earnest, keen to finish our workload before any more surprises were sprung on us. It was during the inspection of the second fridge that I found another bottle of homebrew. You could see the bits of orange floating around the bottom of the bottle, as well as a substantial amount of sugar that hadn't quite dissolved. As I did the previous evening, I tipped it down the nearest sink, then threw the bottle away. The rest of Yarra North checked out fine, and we moved on to Yarra South almost 20 minutes after commencing our search. The new unit checked out to be totally clean. Apart from a couple of bins that hadn't been emptied, there was not much else to find. When we finally reached the last of our units, the usual noises greeted us as we came through the airlock. Loddon North was one of those units that could swing either way in terms of drama. Some months it was fairly quiet and ran like clockwork, while other months it was filled with dickheads and ran like a piece of shit. Before commencing the search, I instead headed for the officer station and started reading the unit log, while Tony headed out to the chook pen to start his own search. There was a section in the back of the log that held the handover notes. Not all officers utilized it, but some did, and it was their notes I was interested in. Unit logbooks were renewed at the beginning of each month, and thus ran for the entirety of each month. Whilst it was only the second day of the month and the new log wouldn't offer up much information, I spotted December's log underneath the new one, meaning it hadn't yet been picked up. I flipped to the back of the book and began to read the notes in reverse, so I could get a timeline from most recent first. Bill Buckley, one of the regulars in the unit, always used the handover section, and it was mostly filled with his own notes. From what I could gather, the unit had several hotheads that had transferred in throughout the past few weeks. The notes repeatedly mentioned 4 or 5 names as being the main headaches for staff. Bill explained several incidents through some of the notes, including friction, standovers, and a couple of beatings that had no outcome. Just as I slapped the book closed, I heard something coming from one of the cells that sat almost directly above me. I turned and looked up to my right, gazing along the line of cell doors that stared back at me. The unit was well lit, and I couldn't make out anything from where I was sitting. I rose to my feet and carefully made my way out of the station and headed to a flight of stairs. Once halfway up, I froze and carefully listened, questioning whether the noise I thought I heard was what I actually had heard. After standing frozen in place for almost 30 seconds, I turned to head back down the stairs, but just as I did, the same sound drifted out towards me, the unmistakable sound of fist on flesh. I turned back, took a couple more stairs up, and froze again. This time, my eyes were at the same height as the floor, and I could see beneath several cells' doors. The cracks were only around an inch or two high, but it was enough to see almost all the way into the rooms beyond. There, underneath the second cell from the end, I could see a pair of feet bouncing around, and then, For a brief second, I could see a second pair. Without hesitating, I climbed the rest of the way up the stairs, stopped in front of the door, and grabbed the keys from my pocket. As I'm rifling through the bunch, I hear a voice from the adjoining cell. "They've been fighting, boss." "Thanks," I reply as I unlock the trap. I slowly drop it and step aside a little, in case I become the new target. As I peer inside, I see one prisoner lying on the edge of his bed, an open wound above one eye. His hands are held up above him, trying his best to shield himself from the attacker standing before him. The other crook is towering over him, his own fists held in front, with one held back ready to thrust forward. They both turn a little to see me peering through. "What's the go, guys?" I ask. The one standing is the first to speak, and it's obvious from the smirk on his face that he's talking shit. "This grub stole some of my canteen. I'm just trying to get it back." As he's snarling the words at me, I reach for my radio and press the duress button. But while it's enough to shut off everybody else from using the radio, it still needs me to call the code in order to bring the cavalry. "Code Foxtrot, Loddon North. Prisoners contained." As I speak the words, the one standing moves back and drops his fists. He knows the fight is done. I look back at the crook lying on the bunk and can already see the difference in the swelling on his face. He must have taken a few to the head, because his left eye is almost completely shut, while there's a definite indentation in his right cheekbone. I peer at the names above the door, then turn my attention back inside. "Which one is Fraser?" The one standing nods. "Fraser, come and pop your hands through, man, just until the soup gets here." He complies totally, and I cuff him, then ask him to keep his arms through the trap for the time being. It's enough to distract him and keep the fight from reigniting. The other crook remains where he's laying. "What happened?" a voice calls from behind me. I turn and see Tony climbing the stairs. In all the excitement, I'd completely forgotten about him, still out in the choke pen while I dealt with this situation. "Just a fight," I reply as the airlock opens and the first few officers come through into the unit. Because I added that the crooks were contained to my code, there's no mad rush into the unit. Instead, most continue mulling around the station as everyone waits for the soup. Gary shows up a few minutes later and immediately comes to the cell. He nods for the door to be unlocked, and I lead the prisoner out and along the tier for a little way to where one of the other officers has already prepared a chair. Whilst Gary begins questioning the prisoner still in the cell, I stay and watch this one, with Tony leaning against the guardrail beside me. It's not long before he begins his annoying heckling of the seated crook. "Get into your celly, huh? What did he steal from you?" It's not so much his words that are annoying, but his tone. Even speaking to someone other than myself, the words rub me the wrong way, almost like sandpaper scraped on my balls. I'm sorry for the analogy, but that's just how irritating he is. "Huh? Steal any girly mags?" The thing about Tony is that when he talks, it's like he's addressing the entire room, as if needing to take all the possible attention and turn it on himself. "Girly mags?" the crook asks. "Yeah, stick mags, titty books. I know what fucking girly mags are. When are we ever allowed those?" Fraser starts to sound annoyed, and it's not what we need. "Tony, do you mind?" I chime in, eyeballing him until he gets the hint. He finally turns and heads back to the open cell, keen to get an eyeful of whatever is transpiring inside. A few moments later, the other crook walks out onto the tier, wearing his own cuffs, and the soup gestures to a couple of other officers. "Take him to medical, please." Gary gestures for Fraser to be brought over, and I walk him back to his cell. Better for the questioning to happen inside the cell, or else the entire story will be eavesdropped by the unit's other occupants. I listen in, but as expected, there's not much to tell. He tries to downplay the assault by blaming it on his cellmate, saying that he had taken some of his shampoo. But Gary has already heard and seen the evidence, something I had not. Fraser had raped the much younger prisoner and beaten him throughout the horrific assault. He would subsequently be taken to hospital by ambulance and treated for a torn rectum. He also suffered a fractured cheek, a laceration above his eye, and a cracked rib. Although I knew the assault was significant, I wasn't expecting it to turn out to be a rape. It just goes to show that you never quite know what you'll find in this place. It really makes you wonder what else could possibly lie around the next corner. We eventually walk Fraser up to Murray North, where he's relocated into a new cell. Other prisoners will most likely target him, and it's safer for everyone to get him out while the rest of the unit is locked down. Once he's locked up, I return to Loudon North and start my report. It takes almost an hour to complete, and I take my time as I know this one could become part of a police investigation. Once finished, I email it through to Gary, phone him to make sure he's happy, then shut the computer down for the night. The rest of the shift goes by without any further surprises, and I manage to avoid Tony for the majority of it. It's only when we escort 3 prisoners down to admissions the following morning that I briefly see him again. When it comes to that guy, there's definitely no love lost. Saturday, January 5th. I returned to the prison after a couple of days off, and part of me is relieved to know that regardless of what happens, Tony Malone is probably not going to bother me tonight. There's always the possibility of overtime, of course, but I'm hopeful that someone above is smiling down on me and is happy for me to avoid that landmine. To my surprise, I'm not on patrol, as I had been expecting. Instead, I've been reallocated to sit in one of the medical units for the night. This one isn't the normal medical section, where standard prisoners are treated for common issues, or where they spend time while sick. This particular medical unit houses those prisoners considered psychiatrically impaired. In other words, those prisoners with mental illnesses severe enough to warrant ongoing medication and medical supervision. I've worked in the unit multiple times before and know that it's the kind of unit that teeters on the edge. Your entire night can be turned on its head by the antics of a single prisoner. I know from personal experience that some crooks that I've had the misfortune of supervising for the night can sometimes make for an unbelievably horrendous shift. I cross my fingers as I head inside and meet up with the 3 remaining day shift crew. To my surprise, Ricky is one of them, and she waves from across the unit as she helps a prisoner with some bedding from a cupboard. "Hey," Lynn Tran says as I drop my bag by the side of the fridge. In this unit, there's no staff room for officers, just one for the nurses that work here, and it's located outside the main unit, inside the corridor that leads to the airlock. "Hi, Lynn," I reply, then drop into one of the chairs. It's still a good half hour until lockdown, so I spend the time doing what all officers do best, engage in chit-chat. It's a great opportunity to catch up on gossip, and there's always plenty to pass the time. It's one of those moments where you wish you had a great big bowl of popcorn, as I sit listening to the crew fill me in on that day's excitement. A female officer named Hillary Turnbull had been walked off for having intimate relations with one of the outlaw motorcycle gang members currently housed in Tambo East. Rumor had it that she was returning to the unit shortly after lockdown, each time claiming to have forgotten something in the unit, then return and quickly head to the crook's cell. It was only when a couple of officers on her crew spoke to the supervisor that they investigated a little further and caught the woman on camera. "Are you serious?" I said, stunned at the stupidity of some people. "How the fuck would she not think someone would check the footage?" "Who knows?" Ricky piped in. "Dumb bitch had been banging him during her tier walks as well. Couple of crooks told day staff that they watched her suck him off in front of them." I rolled my eyes in disbelief. Remember when I said that no 2 days are ever the same? I'm sure by now you have an idea of what I meant. Things are just so unpredictable in this place, it makes for some pretty interesting chats between officers. A few minutes before control call for the count, the day staff call the unit to prep for lockdown. The crooks rush about with final objectives, then make their way back to their own cells and stand by their doors. "At least you have no watches," Ricky whispers to me as she grabs the muster sheet. It was the first time I realized that fact. The unit has 3 observation cells and can sometimes be filled with S-rated watches. Having a couple of S1s in the cells is really painful, each requiring 15-minute viewings throughout the night. S3s aren't too bad, only needing a peek in every hour. The best part of having the cells empty means I have no one to babysit through the night. The observation cells were also deemed temporary cells, sometimes used just to hold someone over. They wouldn't have any of their own gear, so would often buzz up for hot drinks or anything else they needed. With all 3 obsos empty, it also meant that the chances of one filling during the night were quite high. If none of the other obsos and other units were available, then that made me the first port of call for the soup if they needed to house someone in one. "Fingers crossed," I whisper back to Ricky and watch as she heads off to perform the final count for the night. Control calls count correct almost 15 minutes later after twice calling for Loudon North to call their number through. It's not a good look for a unit, particularly when holding up the rest of the prison staff from going home. But once count is called correct, it takes all of 30 seconds for the staff in my unit to disappear out through the door, leaving me with 19 crooks, all of whom have already settled in for the night. When it goes well, it's actually not a bad unit to work in. The nurses perform a silent cell check every hour, and once I switch the lights in the common area off, they complete it via torchlight, which they carry themselves. The nurses generally keep to themselves and will only chat to me occasionally. Most of the time, it's when they need to dispense some out-of-hours meds to a prisoner, maybe some headache tablets that have been requested. Only then do I follow them to the cell and watch as they hand the pills through the trap, before stepping aside and letting me watch the crook swallow said medication. For the majority of the shift, I do nothing but either watch television or engage in writing my next book. I still remember spending years wasting the night away with nothing more than some silly late-night television that barely interested me. I still think about officers who do nothing else but stare at the screen all night. What a waste. I shudder at the thought of the amount of time I wasted away, sometimes trying to imagine how many more books I could have written if I had only used the time more effectively. But hindsight can be a real kick in the pants. I end up writing almost 14 pages during the night. It's a huge effort, and I'm only interrupted twice to help out with meds. Shortly after midnight, the nurse walked past after he finished his hourly checks and started chatting about a holiday he's leaving for the next day. I listen intently, as any holiday to Greece interests me. It is one country I hope to visit myself one day, being a huge fan of ancient history. By the time the sun rises again in the morning and I shut down my computer session, Ricky returns into the unit and hands me an early mark. I'm tired. Probably more tired than most nights, as the writing session really took it out of me. As I thank her and wish her a good day, I grab my bag and slowly start making my way back to the front of the prison, knowing that in a few short hours, I would be back to do it all again. Sunday, January 6th. I had a pretty crappy sleep during the day, and by the time I walk back into the jail, I'm struggling to decide whether I'm in a pissed-off mood or just too tired to want to be here. To my surprise, Claire is sitting in the control room and asks whether I mind heading back to the medical unit for the next 2 nights. One of the regulars has gone on leave, and it would make her job easier with an experienced officer in the unit. I give her an animated salute and grab the allocated keys and battery. Night staff in units simply swap radios with one of the day staff, grabbing a freshly charged battery from control on the way through. My mood improves at the request, and I'm almost whistling by the time I reach the door to the unit. But as I step inside, my good mood comes crashing down as I see all 3 observation cells with their doors closed, fresh names written above each. "Looks worse than it is," a familiar voice calls, and I look towards the station and see Ricky. Only one is S3, and the other 2 just late transfers. It's a small relief. It means I will still probably have to play butler for 2 of them at the start of the night, but the S3 may need hourly watches. I say may because S3s have 2 different regimes which are allocated by the psych nurses. If deemed a genuine suicide risk, they will keep the hourly checks throughout the night. If they believe the crook to be more on the okay side, they reduce the nightly checks to just 2, one before and one after midnight. To my relief, the S3 is of the latter type, meaning once lockdown occurs, it will be a single cup of hot drink for each, and then a good night, Roger Ramjet. I don't need to make it a habit of offering any more drinks than that. Otherwise, you raise their expectation levels, and that will just screw up the next person sent to watch them. Lockup doesn't take long to facilitate, and before I can blink, find myself waving goodnight to the day crew. As the door closes behind them, the silence of the unit warms my heart a little, knowing each of the cells would now be holding a tired and worn-out prisoner keen to do nothing but fall asleep to whatever television show they fancy. I do a slow lap of the unit, walking around the outer edge, listening to the array of sounds coming from beneath the doors. It has an almost dorm-like feel, as if I was doing the rounds in some distant university. There's sounds of TV shows, music playing on various stereos, as well as a flushing toilet here and there. As I pass each door, I take note of the names written in black marker above them. While most of the names bear little meaning for me, the odd one sounds familiar, and I try and remember where I had heard it before. That is, until I freeze before one of the doors, the name hitting me right in the chest like a fist. I feel the icy chill run down my spine as I stare at the name above the door, a name that instantly turns my blood cold. Behind that very door was a man responsible for one of the most callous attacks on a child ever. This piece of garbage murdered his little daughter in one of the most chilling ways imaginable and shocked an entire nation in the process. And all on what should have been that little girl's first day of school. As I stood there staring at the door separating us, I felt physically moved, my hands shaking at the mere thought of him. I've never had such a reaction to a prisoner before, and yet, standing there alone in that unit, with him just a few feet from me, I can tell you that I felt ill. More than that, I was furious. I had to continue, and rather than go on with my leisurely stroll, I made a beeline back to the officer station. "You okay?" I looked up and saw Raj, that evening's psych nurse, standing in the doorway to his office. "Fine," I replied. "You look a bit pale." I felt it. I also felt like my cheeks were on fire, but I did my best to try and hide the fact. "I'm okay. Didn't sleep too well." "Last shift?" It was a typical question, but one that reminded me I had another to go. "Middle. One more." Raj nodded. "Same. Back tomorrow night." He headed off for his own rounds, and as I was about to call out something, one of my obso cells knocked on their door. "Yeah?" I called out when I reached the far side of the station, unsure which door had knocked. "Boss, can I grab a coffee, please?" After finding the right trap, I made it clear that there would be but a single cup. I had work to do and didn't have time to be running a beverage service. One of the other crooks overheard, tapped, and wanted in on the coffee run. The third, my S3, was fast asleep, and I let him be. After giving each of the prisoners their coffee, I headed back to my own spot in the station, turned on the television, and set it to silent. What I really wanted to do was write, But my mind had been temporarily buzzed by an event unlike anything I had felt since arriving at the prison years before. I wait for Raj to return to his office before killing the lights in the common area and then sit forward to close my eyes. I need to exercise some deep breathing in order to calm myself, and I don't want cameras thinking I'm already nodding off. Only when I'm sure I'll be undisturbed for a few minutes do I lean forward in my chair, close my eyes, and start the only way I've ever been able to calm my anxiety. It took almost 10 minutes for me to calm myself enough to just concentrate on the television. Writing? That was a whole different kettle of fish. Despite turning the computer on and bringing up a fresh MS Word page, the cursor simply blinks on and off for what feels like hours. By 10 o'clock, my legs feel cramped from lack of movement, and I go and check my S3. He's still fast asleep, although facing the opposite way from when I first saw him. I do another lap of the unit, but remain at one end, the furthest from the child killer I could get. Is it because I'm a father that I had such a reaction? I'm not sure, but something just hit me. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him. I had the unfortunate task of taking him off the bus when he first arrived at the prison a few months prior. Even that experience didn't hit me as hard as tonight, although I do remember having a reaction at the time. But this time? Maybe it was because I was alone in the unit, and he was just a few feet away, completely unaware that I was even there. To tell you the truth, the reaction I had frightened me. That was one of the few moments when I knew I no longer wanted to be in the prison. I wrote exactly 3 words for the entire night. "Fuck that prick," was all I could manage, and it was one of the longest nights of my career. Each time Raj did his rounds, I wanted to shout out that I was done and heading home. Of course I couldn't, but the temptation was certainly there. By the time day staff came in, I barely spoke a word, simply handing over as briefly as I could, and then heading out before anyone had a chance to strike up a conversation. I was thankful Ricky wasn't amongst them, because if she had been, I would have been unable to leave without a brief chat. Only once I was sitting in my car did the emotions get the better of me. And 30 minutes later, as I drove over a particular bridge and saw the safety fence that had been erected a couple of years before, began to cry, no longer able to keep the tears held in. Monday, January 7th. By the time I walked through the gate again, I felt a little better, mostly because it was the last night of my stretch. After tonight, I would enjoy a couple of nights off, and the prison would be the last thing on my mind. Plus, I knew that I was back in the medical unit, and that meant as long as I didn't allow my emotions to get the better of me, I would be free to continue writing my latest book, one I hoped would show readers that I was also worthy of fictional material. I've often been surprised by how much of my writing has been directly influenced by my time in jail. I have a Word file on my computer, and hidden inside it is a list. On that list live a bunch of ideas that have come to me while at work, ideas that at the time felt as if they would make incredible reads. It's during the long periods of nothingness, sitting in a unit and staring at cells, or crooks, or just other officers going about their business, that the ideas come to me. Most of the time, the ideas arrive as a what-if type of scenario, like, what if he gets out, or what if they were innocent? It's during my walk to the unit that another idea strikes me, and this one I'm mentioning because the story from that idea has already been written. As I walked along the corridor, a group of visitors passed me by, led along by a new officer. He was leading them back towards the front of the prison, through the airlock, and back out into the real world. As they passed me, I wondered what would happen if they actually knew the officer. What if the visitors were, in fact, prisoners, and he was leading them out? It would be the perfect plan, and as I continued on to the unit, wondered what would happen if they were let out to do a crime then returned and pretended to be in the prison the whole time. The cops investigating the crime would never consider anyone locked up, so wouldn't that make for the most perfect alibi? If you're interested in what this idea actually evolved into, the end result is Max Book 6, out now. Personally, I felt it was the perfect follow-up to my first Max series and still think the idea behind the story is unbelievably intriguing. Anyway, that's how some of my ideas come about. I continue on to the unit, and once there, see that only one of the obso cells has been emptied. It's one of the transfers, and the S3 remaining, and tonight, both are sitting in their cells watching TV. Lynn gives me a look as I enter the station, and when she nods her head towards the obsos, I know it can't be good. "Those two have been at it all day. Good luck with them," she whispers, not wanting either of the crooks to hear. That good, huh? Not always, but for the majority of the time, arguments like Lynn was pre-warning me about were nothing more than boredom. Being cooped up in a cell all day has a significant impact on crooks, and it often leads to higher irritability, anger issues, anxiety, and just plain boredom. It's only when I sit down and look at the muster that I see the crook in the obso cell is new, having only transferred in earlier in the day. It turns out he's there because he caused a code in his usual unit and the unit supervisor needed him temporarily transferred out. He's on an isolation routine, which means he's locked down for the majority of the day, with no personal items. In short, I get to take care of him and serve him coffee. As Kate and Lynn prepare to conduct final lockdown, there's a dull thumping that fills the air. For a brief moment, I'm unsure of what it is, but Kate soon fixes that for me. "Will you guys knock it off?" she yells towards the observation cells. Then to me, "Fuck, just winding each other up like a couple of children." The S3, a crook named Shane Tansey, has been antagonizing the other crook by banging on the wall of his cell for no other reason than to annoy. Apparently, it's been working well, because Kelvin Marsh, the unfortunate soul in the other cell, has been biting back every time. Kate shakes her head and heads off carrying the muster. The unit noise levels immediately drop as the prisoners stand by their open doors and wait for the officers to lock them up individually during the final muster. Kate leads with the clipboard, while Lynn follows behind and locks each cell door in turn. There's a definite sigh of relief when Control calls count correct, and like me that very morning, the day staff barely wait before heading out the door, Kate leading the charge. I smile, knowing how great it feels to be walking out after a shift, and quietly look forward to doing the same thing in a few hours. As I flick the computer on, the same dull thumping fills the air, followed by louder thumping as Kelvin retaliates. "Shut the hell up," he yells, as if to back up the wall pounding. The silence from the other cell is antagonizing enough in its own right, and Kelvin follows it up with another wall pounding. I shake my head and continue on with checking my emails. I barely make it through half a dozen before there's a knock on one of the cell doors. "What?" I call out, barely looking up. "Boss." It's Kelvin. "Yes?" "The lady officer said once they leave and the unit is locked down that you'd get me a coffee?" His voice is fairly soft-spoken, and I imagine a skinny kid that would blow away in a gust of wind. "Did she now?" I reply. "Give me 10. Just need to finish something." There's no response, just a slow shuffle as Kelvin returns to his bed. I do as promised and 10 minutes later deliver the cups of drink. I asked Tansey as I passed the first time, and he also put in his order. Better to get them both done at once and move on. My hope for silence once they have their hot brews is quickly extinguished as I hear the familiar tapping start even before I sit back down. "Shut the fuck up!" Kelvin screams, and a couple of other cells from across the unit began to cheer. Blowing up in this place never results in what one hopes. If you think that the interactions between Tansy and Kelvin will simply stop, then you're wrong. This is prison, and if there's one thing crooks love nothing more, it's baiting people. Anyone that thinks they can get a nibble from is fair game, and tonight, Tansy has but one person in his sights. It's almost another hour before Kelvin again tries to retaliate by returning the wall banging. On Tansy's side, he's simply using a single knuckle, enough to generate a sound loud enough for his neighbor to hear. In my time in prison, I've heard some pretty ridiculous things at times, some of which have made it into these books. But what happened next would have to be right up there with the best, maybe even the #1 statement of all time. If you don't knock it off, I'm going to cut myself. I froze, listening to Kelvin's voice taper off as I struggled to hold in the laugh that Tansy was already exploding in his own cell. I sat back, placed my hands in my lap, and simply listened. This, folks, was too good to miss. "You're gonna what?" Tansy asked, as if to confirm what he heard. He was probably just as surprised as I was, and simply needed confirmation that the words he heard were in fact correct. "Stop banging on the fucking wall or I'm going to cut myself." A brief snicker escaped my lips before I could snap them shut. In his own cell, Tansy was bellowing laughter. Not wanting to be made fun of, Kelvin tried to back it up. "And then you're going to be responsible for what happens. Can you live with that, cunt?" I heard Kelvin stand up and walk to his cell door, maybe to ensure his words weren't being misconstrued. "Keep banging and I'm going to tear this plastic plate up and slice my leg." As if to entice him a little, Tansy thumped on the wall again. "Shut the fuck up!" I knew I needed to interject at that point. Baiting each other was one thing, but if Kelvin actually went through with it, I would be the one to be held responsible, and I couldn't have that. First, I went to Kelvin's door and dropped the trap. He was standing just inside, and I could see the anger in his face. "He's just trying to get a rise out of you, that's all. Just turn the volume on your TV up enough, and I bet you wouldn't even hear the banging." He simply stared at me for a moment. He looked as meager as his voice, and I knew he was a loud dog with no bite. If he and his neighbor met without the walls, the crook in front of me would run without hesitation. He began to try and protest a little, but it was a weak effort, and I knew there was little substance behind it. "Okay," he finally said. As I watched him return to his bed, I saw the plastic plate that had been handed to him with his dinner sitting beside his bed. It was torn into several pieces, and I knew that each one had an edge sharp enough to cut. The kid had been serious about cutting, and seeing the scars on his legs, I knew he wasn't an amateur when it came to hurting himself. I closed Kelvin's trap and stepped next door, dropping Tansy's trap. He was simply lying on his bunk, staring at a television that had the volume down to silent. He was still wearing the grin from the previous interaction with his neighbor, and all it took was for me to make eye contact with him for the message to get through. As I closed the trap and returned to my station, I saw the shadows beneath Tansy's door disappear and the cell darken in an instant. He had killed his TV and was turning in for the night. It wasn't what I had been expecting, but I took it. Once he went to sleep, Tansy's neighbor didn't make another peep. A couple of hours later, he too turned his television off and joined the rest of the unit in slumber. While it was a brief interaction on my part, it probably saved myself a lot of headaches if I hadn't. The rest of the night played out just as it had the previous couple of shifts. It was the perfect time to write, and writing is exactly what I did. By the time my relief came in the following morning, my eyeballs were practically hanging out of their sockets. I was beat and looking forward to a couple of days off, which is exactly what I did, and enjoyed every moment. Thursday, January 10th. Despite being rostered on as Patrol 3, I decided to utilize a sick day, as I had some family issues to take care of. It's the kind of issues that siphon a lot of energy and brain space from a person, and I knew that in my state, prison was not where I needed to be. This was one of those days that tend to rock families for a long time to come, and when you get into this kind of zone, walking into a high-risk environment where volatility is the flavor of the day, it's best to make a mature decision and keep yourself out of it, which is exactly what I did. Friday, January 11th. Came in for a patrol shift, and although I would have preferred to remain home, knew that it wouldn't do me any good wallowing alone. Sometimes it's better to surround yourself with people that will take your mind off things, and this place is the perfect place to do just that. As I come through control, I see Eugene sitting in one of the chairs, and he throws me a salute. "Can you grab the night roster from the desk drawer when you get there? I haven't had a chance to fill it out yet. Just pop yourself down wherever." Sounded perfect to me, and put a little bounce into my step. It meant I could choose my own units again, and yes, I chose the Yaras and Loddon North. There's something comforting about looking after the same units. For one, I had an idea of which crooks I looked after. I also knew the routine, plus the normal hiding places that needed extra attention. As I reached the supervisor's office, a familiar face was already waiting, one I hadn't seen in some time. "Con, my friend, how are you?" I asked. "Good, buddy. You on tonight, too?" I nodded, and he clapped me on the back. Needless to say that once I had my name written in the appropriate box, Con wrote his beneath mine. We headed off to the staff room next, to drop our gear and wait it out until Control makes the final call on the day shift. There's something holistic about grabbing a quiet spot before a shift, and as I head for my usual spot, Con heads off on another errand. Once again, the sounds of the prison fill my ears as I sit with my eyes closed. The banter between inmates, the occasional shouts from one of the adjoining yards, and even an airplane flying overhead. "Did you hear about Kim?" I open my eyes and see Con already sitting down. His voice startled me a bit, but not as much as the fact I didn't even hear him return. "Kim? No, what happened?" Kim had been another one of the "I'll sleep with a crook while in prison" gang. The kind that jumps the fence and prefers to date prisoners rather than supervise them. Came into reception to put money on her boyfriend's account. "What?" I asked, surprised enough to sit up. Kim had been walked off the prison grounds almost 6 months before and instantly fired. She had been discovered communicating with a prisoner by her then fiancé, who subsequently spilled the beans to the prison's hierarchy. What they discovered was that Kim had smuggled in a cell phone, plus charger, and some other minor things. She was extremely lucky to avoid jail herself. "Imagine that," Con said, disgusted. "Not an ounce of fucking self-respect. Walks back in as if she's married to the crook, then greeting staff like an old friend." "Anyone say anything?" "Vicky did, but it flew straight over Kim's head. Don't think she was even listening." "Wait, they can put money into accounts online now?" Con nodded. "Exactly. That bitch wanted to come in. Wasn't even here for a visit." "Dude, that's fucked up," I said, blown away. I don't understand how some people function. But then again, this place has always been renowned for the weird and wonderful. Is it any wonder that these books continue to share so many different situations? We wait for a count to be called correct, then head back to admissions to see if any late returns need escorting. It turns out that there are several, but none for our units. Rather than disappear, Con and I pitch in and grab a couple of crooks who need returning to Tambo West. It's right around the corner from Yara North, and will help the guys out a bit. The prisoners are late arrivals and have a full kit to carry down to the unit, so we don't bother cuffing them. They seem to be in control, and keeping their hands free will make carrying their bags a lot easier. We engage the crooks in small talk as we walk, and find one of them to be a real newcomer. in for his first ever stretch. He's on remand and doesn't know his fate as yet, but thinks he may get off, his lawyer giving him hope. The other has been in a couple of times before and is quiet as he walks along. I can tell he's not happy to be here, maybe doing it tough as he knows what to expect. Neither Khan nor I press him any further and simply continue walking, keen to get on with our night. Once we dropped each prisoner into their new cell and added their names into the unit log, we return to our normal path and head to Yara North. As we come through the airlock, the usual smell of the unit greets us, one of the few where the scent doesn't knock you off your feet. Tonight, what we smell is some sort of roast dinner. Because the unit finishes cooking some of the meals in the oven, the smell sometimes lingers throughout the common area for hours. It's not always good, but tonight, it's enough to remind me of my own hunger. We do our searches and find nothing of interest in any of the units. For the time being, it appears that the crooks have hidden their stash well enough to keep it for the weekend, which is something I myself am looking forward to. The morning doesn't have anything planned, as transfers don't happen on weekends. It means we sit around talking shit for hours before the sun is finally high enough in the sky for us to go home. I give Khan a final handshake out in the car park, ask him to wish his family well from me, and head off to my own car. It's the end of an interesting week, and I'm glad to see the back of it. Monday, January 14th. Was rostered in Goulburn East tonight, and when I reached the unit, found the atmosphere to be rather toxic. Several prisoners were lined up along the top tier and were yelling abuse to another crook who was busy mopping the floor. The officers didn't appear to be paying any of them the slightest attention, and so I headed to the main office to drop my gear. Inside, I found Salesh sitting at the computer and busy typing something. He looked up when I entered, offered me a brief wave, and immediately returned to his work. His face had lost all of its usual cheeriness. "You all good, my friend?" I asked, putting my food in the fridge. "Tough day," he half whispered. "Sorry to hear that. I haven't been here all weekend, first shift back." He looked up at that and briefly eyed me. "You haven't heard about Roland?" I shook my head. Roland Burns is what you'd call a long-term officer who had the kind of temperament that saw him often forgotten by many because of how quiet he was. He didn't involve himself in gossip, kept mostly to himself, but held the respect of both officers and prisoners due to his high work ethics. No, why? Didn't get into a code, did he? Salesh's face never changed, remaining vacant as he spoke. Roland is dead. The words hit me like a baseball bat to the face. I was stunned, barely able to reply as my throat felt as if I'd swallowed sand. Dead? It was all I could manage. Died from a biking accident. His wife called him in as missing on Saturday. They found him yesterday. Found him? I couldn't make sense of the words. He'd hit something while riding and ended up in the bushes by the road. Whilst Roland Burns may not have been a close friend of mine, I considered him the kind of work colleague anybody would want beside them. I was shocked to hear of his tragic passing, and as I stood listening to Salesh reveal the circumstances, found my legs feeling weak. I took a seat and felt myself unable to move, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. Dead. Roland Burns. One of the most helpful officers you could ever meet. He never judged anyone for their mistakes or lack of knowledge, instead, always happy to step in and help. The officer's lack of energy eventually makes sense, and I finally understand. I also think back to walking into the prison and the lack of enthusiasm from almost everybody I passed. I couldn't believe my ears, and when I logged into the computer, found the emails management had sent over the course of the weekend. As the final lockdown approached and each of the officers came through the office to grab their bags, they each shook with me, wished me a good night, and slowly exited the unit. There wasn't much to say, and I felt just as upset as they did. Any death is always hard to bear, especially when it's someone you respect and look up to. Roland was the kind of officer many tried to replicate, always carrying himself with dignity and respect. The good thing about Goulburn East at night is that there's really nothing to do but go about your own business. Other than answer random intercom calls from crooks, the rest of the night was your own. And to make things better, crooks rarely buzzed up in here, because for the most part, there was nothing to ask for. This meant I had a whole night of nothing before me, plenty of time to ponder the news, let it sink in, and remember the man. There's not much to share about the shift, and I don't want to bore you with things that aren't really exciting. I grieved in my own way that night. I probably sat staring into space for hours, trying my best to deal with the shock. Whilst not a close friend, he was still someone I knew and respected, and that meant he had made an impression on me. The night went quickly, and I returned to my car with the same silence so many had passed me with the previous evening. It must have shown on my face because no one called out or tried to high-five me. What else is there to say about the death of a well-respected colleague? Rest in peace, Roland. There's a definite hole left in this place, one that could never be filled. Tuesday, January 15th. It's not easy coming back in after the previous night's revelation, but I quickly find comfort when I'm asked to head back to the psych medical unit for the night. It's probably one of my favorite places to hide when feeling the way I do, especially when the unit runs the way I hope. To my despair, one of the observation cells has an occupant, and I see the S1 written on the door as I pass it. When I see the name, it does little to fill me with hope, and it's Ricky that gives me the stare of frustration as I enter the station. "Yep, he's back," she said as I grab a seat. Andrew Bates hasn't been in our prison for more than a year, but he's the kind of prisoner you'd rather forget. Whilst not completely mentally challenged, he does have his issues and knows how to play the game. He's not one to shy away from cutting himself, and when he really gets going, can almost rise to the levels of Toby Manning. "How's he been?" I ask, grabbing the S1 folder and quickly scanning the notes about him. "Not too bad. He might hit you up for a hot drink after lockdown, but I've already prepped him for you." "All good," I mutter. "If it means keeping them quiet, I don't mind grabbing someone a hot drink to shut them up." The notes reveal that he returned to the prison the previous Sunday and almost immediately got into an altercation with an officer. It didn't take long for him to carve the officer's initials into his leg, then continue on with threats and verbal abuse. Once he met with a psych nurse and threatened to slice his own throat, he was placed on S1 and given a holiday in this unit. "Just don't give him the TV remote. Pam nearly did earlier, and you know what he likes to do with batteries?" I nodded, only too aware of Andrew's previous history of swallowing batteries and hoping for free trips to the hospital so he could harass the nurses and enjoy an ambulance ride. It's not long before the unit is mine again, and I fire up the computer with hopes of getting some writing done. It's been a few days since I've put pen to paper, and for a writer, can feel as if something is missing from your life. But just as I begin typing, the intercom buzzes. I look up and see it's my S1 trying to get my attention. I press the button, but rather than speak through the intercom, I simply call out to him. I mean, hey, the guy was like 10 feet from where I was sitting. "Can I have the remote, please?" "I can change the channel for you. Do you know what you want to watch?" I doubt he did, considering you need the remote to be able to call up the online schedule. "Dunno what's on," came the reply. To make my job easier, I quickly brought up a website with a TV guide, then printed it off. I took it down to his cell door, but instead of handing it through to him, I simply opened the window portion of the trap and pressed the guide against it. "Check this out and let me know." I couldn't hand the actual pages through. Being an S1 meant he could have access to nothing, not even plastic cups. And given his history, he was likely to grab the pages, fold them up, and poke his eyeball out or something. It was a chance I wasn't prepared to take. He spent a few moments scanning the pages, then told me his selection. I dropped the trap, asked him to sit on his bunk, then pointed the remote towards the back of the cell and bounced the signal back to the television. When he gave me the thumbs up, I closed the trap and returned to my seat. It was maybe an hour before Andrew called upon me a second time. He caught me mid-sentence, and I didn't acknowledge him the first time. I wanted to get through the train of thought first, and only once I was sure I captured the section just the way I wanted did I respond. He wanted another channel change, and I repeated the process. But just as I was about to close the trap again, he whispered something that stopped me. "I've got a razor blade." His voice was quiet, withdrawn almost. I'm not sure whether he intended for me to hear, but I did, and now that I knew, couldn't leave it alone. "Sure you don't want to just hand it to me?" He shook his head. "What do you want a razor blade for anyway?" "So I can cut myself." "But why?" I couldn't make sense of it, but I also knew that a lot of people cut themselves. For some, it was all they had to help them feel anything. "I have it just in case," he offered, but I knew I couldn't let it be. "Okay, well, your show is on. Enjoy." I closed the trap, returned to the station, and phoned through to the nurse who's sitting in the office at the other end of the unit. When I tell him about the blade, he comes immediately. "Want me to try?" I nod, but also tell him that I'll contact the soup. Whilst the nurse talks with Andrew through the window in his cell door, I phone the supervisor. It's Gary again, and he tells me to sit tight and keep Andrew busy. He'll grab a couple of the tactical boys and drop by to do a strip search. The nurse's attempts to talk Andrew out of the blade turn out exactly as I predicted. And when Gary turns up with 2 tactical boys and they don't find any sign of the blade, I'm not surprised. They even bring with them a metal detector and scan both Andrew and the mattress in his cell. Of course he was lying. Of that I was already quite sure. But for the sake of covering my own butt, I had to make sure to follow protocol. If Andrew ended up cutting himself later that night, I, at least, had done everything in my power to try and prevent it. After thanking each of the staff and wishing them a good night, it wasn't long before it was just me and the unit again. Andrew tried once more to have his television changed, but that was the perfect moment for me to pull the pin and kill the TV for the night. Despite putting up somewhat of a protest, it didn't take long for him to calm enough to nod off and call it a night. It wasn't much of an eventful night, but for the most part, it ended up being productive. By the time the morning crew arrived, I had a good dozen or so pages of writing under my belt. And while the night was nice and quiet, little did I know that things were about to go crazy, with an event that would affect everybody within the walls. Saturday, January 19th. There's one distinct way that you always know when something is going on in the prison when you first turn up, and I mean even before parking your car. That is, if there's a crowd hanging around the entrance. When I turned up for my night shift today, I had heard nothing from anyone, and thus had no indication that there was anything wrong. That is, until I pulled into the car park and saw the scene laid out before me. It turns out that the previous night had been something of what most of us would call a shit show. There had been a fire in one of the main buildings, and this fire had essentially knocked out several key areas of the prison that were required to operate it. I'm talking the maintenance, control room, the main sally port, as well as multiple offices and storage rooms. With the main buildings out of commission, there were so many critical processes unable to be completed that normal places would have shut down operations. But as we had actual prisoners still to consider, that option was never going to be open to us, especially given the size of the prison. There were already a few night shift officers waiting to be let in through the backup sally port, and I quickly joined them to find out what had happened. It would be a nightmare night, of that I was already certain, but I didn't know just how far the damage actually went. It turned out that things were actually much worse than I first anticipated, although to some extent, they were also better. More specifically, worse for them, better for me. The fire had not only destroyed some pretty critical departments, but also crucial equipment, such as cameras and other surveillance tools. What this meant for the prisoners was an open-ended lockdown, one no one was really sure how long would continue. It also meant that there were essentially no emergency intercom communications from the cells. This meant someone had to remain in every single unit for the night, and not just the usually nightly manned units. That was one of the reasons I was amongst almost 3 times the normal number of night shift staff, with most called in for overtime. There was an excited buzz hanging over the crowd as each newcomer was either adding to the conversation or reacting to it with excitement. It took almost an hour for us to gain access, and the process was pretty painful. After the initial identification of each officer, we were all taken through the sally port and led to where a makeshift tent had been erected. Inside the tent sat a second smaller tent with a window on one wall, inside which sat one of the usual control room officers. After another 20 minutes of back and forth, I finally received a working radio and a bunch of keys, plus a unit allocation. To my relief, I returned back to the psych medical unit. It meant that, for the most part, my night was going to be as close to normal as would be possible, while other places in the prison would try and feel their way through the shift. When I got to the unit, there were about half a dozen officers sitting around the station, appearing engrossed in light banter. I greet the mob, stow my gear, and lean against one of the counters as Pam continues with her story about some crook that had buzzed up asking for toilet paper. I'm sure it had a funny side to it, but at that moment, I'd missed the punchline. "Should be an easy night for you," Patrick said to me, one of the regulars in here. "No watches, and the soup's preoccupied with other matters." Having no suicide watches was a blessing, but I could only imagine the stress the supervisors would endure throughout the night. The radio had been active nonstop, and it wasn't until right before control called for count that I found out there were also cell phones. "Yep, each unit has their own. Keep it on you, because if they need you, chances are they'll use the cells. There's no landlines." I nearly slapped my head. Of course there were no landlines. With everything else that had been cut off, phones would have been one of the first things lost. "But the good news," Pam began, pointing at the computer. "There's internet." "Wait, what?" I replied, a few of the officers laughing at my surprise. "You heard right. We have internet. Turns out they needed internet and set it up through Wi-Fi. Enjoy." I double-checked just to make sure, but she was right. The internet had landed. You might be wondering why that excited me. We didn't have the internet, as too many people abused it back when it was available. I knew that the current offering would also be abused, and thus wanted to take advantage of it. For one, it meant I could simply email my nightly writing through to myself. It made things so much easier than needing to borrow someone's password and trying to go through their setup. What I mean by borrowing someone's password is that several of the long-term officers have managed to hang on to their initial internet access. It's not what you know, it's who you know in this business. Once the day staff finished their trap muster, they returned to the station as the rest of the gang dispersed, most heading off to the front of the prison to be let out. Pam phoned through the number via the cell, then sat back and waited for control to call it correct. Once they did, the rest of the team disappeared within seconds. Whilst I was lucky enough to have this unit, I could hear the frustration out in the prison via the nonstop radio traffic. There were work crews actively trying to restore basic systems, while regular staff had to provide escorts, plus arrange themselves into groups to monitor units throughout the night. One of the biggest shortages were torches, would you believe? As the work crews made their way around, there would be rolling blackouts, most of which would affect most of the units. My own cell rang at around 10 that night, and was advised that my own power may be cut off and I should prepare myself. I always carried a torch with me anyway, so that part didn't affect me. And I had already been conducting cell checks, so it really didn't make a difference to me. But once the power did go off, I was left sitting in darkness, with just the barest of shadows and the voices in my head to keep me company. And what does a writer do when caught up in such a situation? We think. We let our imaginations run free and take mental notes of any worthwhile situations that arise. While sitting there in the darkness, I began to hear one of the prisoners talking to themselves. He was asking questions, most of which I could barely make out. But from where I sat, it actually sounded as if he was holding up his end of a conversation, the other side which I couldn't hear. As I sat there listening, I remembered watching a crook a few months prior while working in Murray North. That crook also appeared to hold a conversation with nobody but himself. The strange thing about him and the one I was listening to now was that they didn't answer themselves back. It was as if they really believed someone was watching. Do you know what happened next? I came up with an idea for a book that asked the question, what if? Think about it. How do you really know that there's no one else in that cell with them? Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they may not exist. To put it into perspective, go back 100 years and try and explain a cell phone to someone. Or go back 200 years and try and explain radio waves. Just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not really there. As I sat in the dark, listening to the crook talking, I didn't hear the soup walk in, not until he was almost on top of me. His eyes were just as climatized to the darkness as my own and didn't need the torchlight to walk around. Just doing a check. Everything okay? I nodded, then remembered the darkness. Yep, all's good. I'll just do the one check tonight. Have to try and stay on top of these workers that keep coming and going. I could only imagine the crazy scenario playing out down the front of the prison. He sounded frustrated, and I totally understood. All good. I'll let you know if I need anything. He waved, then disappeared back out into the night via the side door. I watched until he closed the door, then sat back and returned to my brain space. Whilst it was difficult sitting in the dark for most of the night, I had my own rounds to keep me awake, checking in with each of the cells every hour. Most of the night went by without a hiccup. I say most because I did have one request for headache tablets, and when the nurse didn't appear quick enough, the crook wanted to kick off. But he was eventually handed his pills, swallowed them in front of me, and returned to bed. The lights came on around 5 that morning, and it wasn't long after that when the first of the day crew arrived back. It was certainly one of the more interesting shifts, and I knew that my next night would most probably be the same. Sunday, January 20th. It seems that by the time I returned to the prison, very little progress had been made through the day to try and simplify the entry process. Although, rather than being walked through the backup sally port, we get taken through the main sally port instead. It speeds the process up by about 2 minutes and means we have more of a direct route to the key allocation window. But that's about it. I'm allocated to one of the work crews working out behind Murray North, and for the first half of the night, find myself sitting on a milk crate as I watch these guys working inside a small hole in the ground, one barely large enough for a grown man to sit in. He's surrounded by what looks like 1,000 different cables, each split to even more cables. It's a big, confusing mess, and I try to keep myself occupied, although know that eventually my eyes will begin to try and take over with fatigue if I'm not careful. The three-man crew engage me in some conversation, but for the most part, concentrate on the job at hand, something I don't understand nor am interested in. I lead them back through the sally port on a number of occasions to retrieve more tools, and each time have to wait in the sally port as the control officer documents each and every piece of equipment they carry. It's a long and tedious process, one that begins to get old very quickly. During one brief moment, we have a bit of company when one of the crooks in Murray North begins singing to us through his cell's window. His voice sounds as raspy as a 50-year smoking veteran and can hold a tune about as well as a screwdriver. But he has spirit and keeps the boys somewhat amused as they continue working. But after about half an hour, he gives up and disappears back into his cell. The lads finish this particular job by around 2, and the soup calls for me to relieve one of the officers in Murray North itself. There's already 2 officers in there, and I lend a hand by conducting several of the cell checks for them. We talk shit for a few hours while one of the boys ducks off to one of the empty cells for a nap. Each to his own, I guess. The power returns at around 5 again, and is the perfect time for us to start making the toast for the crooks. Yes, in Murray North, they have their breakfast delivered to their cell door. Talk about service. After running around 180 pieces of bread through the toaster, we plate it up with some butter, then begin dispersing it through the traps. While some crooks are already standing by their doors waiting, others need an extensive shout-out to wake up. Once breakfast has been served, we return to the station and sit out the remaining hour, keen for the night to be over. For me, it means almost an entire week off, not due for a return until the following Saturday. It's a small win to an otherwise full-on month already. My biggest hope is that the processes are more streamlined when I return. One can only hope. Saturday, January 26th. Returning after almost a week off isn't easy, especially when almost half the operations around the prison have changed during that time. For one thing, getting into the place feels like a maze, with the entrance relocated to an entirely different spot. Even the entry process had changed, with officers required to go through several new requirements in order to gain admission. But the good news is that getting the keys and radio is a lot easier and takes about half the time, so I'm inside a lot quicker. The other good thing is that the power has been restored to most of the areas, including the cell emergency intercoms, which means most of the units no longer require overnight staff to man them. For me, I'm allocated to Goulburn West, another one of the step-down management units. It's one of these retirement homes, other officers call them, because the officers working there consider the unit a place to kick back and enjoy retirement. The crooks in Goulburn West are mostly long-termers, as well as protection. They tend to have runouts, but generally don't venture outdoors except into their own chook pen. Plus, the number of prisoners in the unit is normally less than 20, also making it one of the smallest units in the prison. It's a fairly good unit to work in, and only has a single observation cell. Tonight, I find the OBSO cell door open as a prisoner is walking around behind the inner skin. I can see the shadow, but because there's no light on, can't see who it is. As I near the station, I point at the door and mouth the words to Salesh, who's sitting on the desk. Just a transfer, not on watch. I breathe a sigh of relief, shake hands with the crew, then head off and drop my gear in the staff room. Once back out in the unit, I join in the end-of-shift conversation, tonight being about the way the fire had caused so many other issues to be highlighted. You know the problem with this place? Salesh starts. It's reactive, not proactive. They'll wait for someone to get hurt before acting. A couple of the others nod in agreement, and I can't help but do likewise. I guess it's the same for any place where money is a driving factor. Profit will always come before anything else. Just as the conversation becomes intriguing, control calls for count, and our little party comes to an end, everybody dispersing to various points around the unit. I hit the computer and start to check my emails when Salesh leans in close. "Okay, now don't laugh, but," he begins, then opens a drawer to my left. He reaches in, rifles around for a bit, then pulls out a bag of lollipops. "You brought me sweets for the night?" I ask curiously. He shakes his head and frowns. "Not quite. These are for our friend in the OPSO." "Okay," I ask, knowing there's more to it than that. "If he asks you for one, that is the time you get him to do something for you. Need him to turn off the TV? He'll ask you for one, and you use this to blackmail him?" I ask. It sounded like blackmail. "Yes, it does sound like that. But his carer called it positive reinforcement, asking him for something in return when he wants one." "That's positive reinforcement? I thought positive reinforcement was giving someone credit where credit was due." Salesh continued frowning. "Well, this carer said that this is how you use the lollipops." He slapped me on the back a couple of times. "Enjoy." I muttered some sort of thanks, then returned to my emails, after glancing towards the open-skinned door. Was he going to give me grief? I wasn't sure, but hoped he'd just hop into bed and go to sleep. It took much longer for count to be called correct, because communication with control was still restricted to the cell phones. It made calling in the numbers quite difficult, and for something that normally took less than 10 minutes was still going on 30 minutes later. Needless to say, the grumblings from the day staff were quite substantial. But once the call came through that it was correct, the day shift officers practically ran out through the door. I didn't blame them. The time already almost half an hour past their finish time. I continued sorting through my emails, then opened up the news. Having the internet was quite a treat, and it gave me time to catch up on world affairs, as well as a few things I'd been considering in the shopping department. As I was scrolling through several websites, I had a sudden thought about our next holiday destination. Just as I was about to start exploring it in earnest, there was a tap from the open cell door, and I looked up to see the crook staring at me through the cloudy perspex. "Boss, can I have a pop?" I looked at him for a moment, unsure how to react. Was it too early to get him to go to bed? Instead of just saying yes or no, I got up and walked to the door. The name Humphreys was written on the tag, and I dropped the trap. "Humphreys?" He nodded. "Got a first name?" "Ben?" His tone made it clear that he had some sort of a mental impairment, and I immediately knew the unpredictability. "Listen, Ben, anyone talk to you about bedtime yet?" He shook his head. "Have a lollipop now, 'cause when you finish it, that's the time the lights get turned off." He looked a little alarmed at that. "Not all of them. You'll still see me working at the station over there. But everyone needs to sleep at that time. That's why the light will be switched off." He continued gazing at me blankly. "Is that okay?" He slowly nodded, and I hoped the message would sink in before the time came for lights off. I went back to the station, grabbed one of his lollipops, and returned with it. His face lit up when he saw it, and I doubt he heard anything else I said. It didn't matter. If it kept him quiet, I would have given him lollipops all night long. It turned out that I didn't need to ask twice once the time came to switch everything off. All it took was for me to go to a cell, tap on the door, and switch the light off. I left the television on for him, as I know from personal experience that for some, it helped with nodding off. By the time I returned to the station, the unit was mostly quiet, apart from the occasional toilet flush, cough, or television noise. I settled myself in for more writing, stopping only to answer the occasional intercom. The good thing about this unit is that, unlike Murray North, not everyone needed breakfast prepared for them. In this unit, those who wanted morning toast would buzz up and ask for it. Most mornings, The total would only ever be 4 or 5. I think the most toast I'd ever served in here was 6, much less than the unit across the way. The night went by with little fanfare, and I began making the 4 lots of toast a little after 6. As part of the process, you also had to do a complete welfare check on the unit, and that meant opening every cell's trap and getting a response from the crooks. In Murray North, the process was simple because everyone was handed morning toast. But in here, the rest of the crooks would still be sleeping, and not all of them were happy to be disturbed. The funny thing with morning checks is that getting told to fuck off is all part of the job. The reason you drop the trap in the first place is to make sure the crook is still alive, and all you need is a response from them to ensure that is the case. So, them calling you a prick, telling you to fuck off, or calling for you to beat it, dog, is just a response which tells you they're still alive. Call me anything you like, just answer me and go back to sleep. And that's exactly how I look at it. It's not one of the most exciting things to do, but it's enough to wake you up from the long night. Plus, it builds your adrenaline as you never quite know what's waiting for you when you drop the trap. Some officers, especially those who have been painful to an inmate or two, have found themselves the victims of shit bombs and piss bombs thrown through open traps. There's even been the occasional hot watering that have caused significant injuries. It's one of the reasons officers may want to reconsider puffing their chest out too much in an attempt to prove how much power they yield. This is no place for bad attitude. There's been many times where I've dropped the trap and nearly pissed my pants when a smiling face stares back at me from the shadows because the crook had been waiting for me with their face pressed against the door. This morning, the rounds are finished without incident, and I hand through the toast as I do my welfare checks. Once done, I head back to the desk, wait for the staff, and continue surfing some random sites to keep myself awake. It wasn't a bad night, but I know within a few short hours lies another one just waiting for me. Fingers crossed, it's as easy as this one was. Sunday, January 28th. I'm given my keys and spare battery almost an hour after turning up for my shift because the Sally port is broken. A delivery truck failed to heed the signs advising not to proceed until the roller door is completely up, and because of the driver's impatience, managed to damage the roller door in the process. Because of that screw-up, the backlog of trucks and prison transfers and all sorts of headaches continued to accumulate and sent most of the other posts into panic mode. It wasn't the kind of start I was looking for, but then it just goes hand in hand with the unpredictability of this place. You have a transfer coming in from Tambo East, Salesh tells me when I finally roll into the unit. The rest of the crew is already waiting outside in the sunshine, pissed at being held up themselves. His details are in the email I forwarded to you. Just be sure to get him a couple of things, otherwise he may kick off. I thank him and wait for him to go, aware of the time and the fact everybody was on unwanted overtime. He waved back appreciatively and disappeared out the door, leaving me to feel my way through the first few minutes of my shift. Before I have time to unpack my food into the fridge, the phone rings, with Claire on the other end telling me about the transfer. Josh Cakeman is coming over to you. Did they tell you? Yeah, they did. He won't have any gear with him, so just make sure he has some basics. He'll most likely get his gear tomorrow. What happened? I asked, still unsure of why he was being transferred. He got jumped, moving him out for his own protection. Okay, no worries. I'll be ready. She thanked me and hung up. I checked the roster to find which cell he'd been allocated, then climb up to the second tier and go to the cell. The door is open, which is always a good sign. As a unit night officer, I don't have a cell key on my chain, a precaution which prevents officers being able to unlock cells in their units. You'd be surprised how far some officers will go to make friends. I groan as I see the empty cell before me, with not even a mattress on the bed. Shaking my head, I turn for the stairs and start to build a list of things in my mind, with a mattress at the very top. I check the storage room and find a mattress leaning against one wall. On a shelf opposite, I find a bedsheet, blanket, and pillow, as well as a towel on the top of the cupboard. It's a good start. He's also going to need several other things, especially if he's going to come without any of his own items. Just as I'm carrying the gear up the stairs, the unit's airlock opens and 2 officers, Claire and the crook, walk in. Perfect. I haven't even had time to get him the basics and he's already turned up. "Up here," I call out, and they look up at me. Claire points to the stairs and the 2 officers walk Cakeman up towards me. Before they reach the top of the stairs, one of the crooks on the bottom has already seen the new arrival. "Hey, Cake!" the crook shouts under his door. The escorted crook turns his head and looks to where the voice came from. "Yo, who's that?" "It's Joker, man. What happened?" "Got jumped by a cunt in Tambo." "Fuck, man. You okay?" I reached the cell and dropped the mattress and gear on the bed and walked back out, holding the door open for the procession to go straight in. "Got me a couple of times, but I'm good. Hey, talk soon." As they led him into the cell, I could see the extent of the jumping. His t-shirt had extensive blood splatter on it. His left eye was bruised with a small cut on the brow. His top lip looked a bit puffy, and there may have been a cut on it as well. "He's a bit excited, but he should be fine," Claire said, as she waited for the officers to uncuff him. "All good," I returned. Once they had their cuffs off, the 2 officers locked the cell and headed back down the stairs. I was barely halfway down myself when Cakeman began to tap on the door. Claire looked at me, smiled, and said, "Good luck." "Aha," I said, and turned back. "Hey, boss, when's my stuff coming?" I groaned inside, realizing in an instant what hadn't been shared with the unfortunate Cakeman. "Your stuff won't be here till tomorrow, man." "Tomorrow? Nah, fuck that. I need my gear. At least the TV, you know what I mean?" "I just walked in the door myself. Give me a bit and I'll get some things together for you. Just sit tight for a moment, all right?" He nodded and I closed the trap. Just as I reached the stairs for the second time, he tapped the door again. "Hey, boss, can you give me some ice?" I groaned again, turned back, and dropped the trap. Again. "I need ice for my eye. Hurts like crazy." "Want me to get the nurse up with some painkillers?" "Yeah, but also some ice, please." I could have kicked myself right there and then. Never willingly add to their demands, or else you'll just spend more time chasing shit you didn't need to. As I closed the trap, I didn't even know whether he'd already been given painkillers. Rookie mistake, I thought to myself. To shut him up, I went to the unit staff room's fridge freezer and found some ice cubes. I put some into a plastic cup and walked it back up the stairs. This night, I would be sure to get my stairs workout happening. "Thanks, boss," Cakeman said as he took the ice. "Any coffee yet?" "Give me a bit. Need to find a kettle." He nodded, then returned to pacing his cell. Finding a kettle isn't always easy. For one, the prison doesn't offer kettles, as prisoners purchase them for themselves. Some units tend to have spares from time to time, and it's one of those I hoped I would find. As I returned to the storeroom for a more in-depth search, I found a spare prison-issue t-shirt, a kettle, and also one of the prison-issue televisions, but there was no remote and no aerial cable. With at least some items to offer, I returned to his trap and handed through the kettle, the spare t-shirt, a cup, spoon, and a small wad of coffee and sugar. The television I put next to the door, just until I found the aerial cable as well. "No TV?" he immediately asked. "Just need to find the aerial." I went back to the station and hunted through drawers and cupboards, but only found 2 damaged cables. Instead of walking up the stairs again, I buzzed him instead. "What am I going to do?" "Could always just sleep," I suggested, but knew that was never going to happen. "Just see if you can find one, please, boss. I need my stuff. I really do. There's a watch and a letter I really need. Can someone go and get them?" Not sure. I can ask, but I wouldn't expect anything tonight. Just my watch and letter. Seriously, I really need them. I cut the connection and shook my head. This guy was not going to just lie down. He was too pumped up, and just as I picked the phone up, I heard him start yelling abuse to the crooks at Murray North, located just a few feet from his window. "Hey, Cake," the original crook yelled across the unit. "Hey, yo," Cakeman shouted under his door. And that was when a second stream of yelling kicked in. Cakeman was yelling abuse through his window and holding a long-distance conversation across the unit. Inside, I groaned yet again. I'm somewhat relieved when Claire agrees to send a couple of patrol staff over to Tambo and grab Cakeman his requested items. I ask to add an aerial cable and cross my fingers as the shouting continues from the farthest cell in the unit. As I sit waiting for the officers to deliver said items, the intercom buzzes and I see that it's from Adam McDonald, a.k.a. Joker. "Hey boss, can you come and grab this stuff and take it up to Cakeman?" When I drop the trap on Joker's cell, he holds out a bag containing a bottle of soda, some coffee, soap, and some instant noodles. I make sure each item is still sealed, then nod my head. "Hey, thanks, Joker!" Cakeman screams past my ear as I hand the items through. Nothing like a bit of prisoner loyalty. Apart from another request for ice, Cakeman leaves me alone for the most part. He doesn't ask for the painkillers again, and I figure that if he doesn't need them, I'm not about to annoy the nurses when they're not really needed. Claire confirmed that he'd been attended to by medical staff after his code was called, and that's good enough for me. The patrol staff come through for me and bring a substantial amount of his belongings, almost an hour later, including toiletries, reading material, the watch, letter, and aerial cable. I thank them and follow them to take the stuff up to his cell. As I drop the trap, Cakeman is still in the middle of shouting his insults across to Murray inmates, and it makes me smile how tough some of these crooks are when safely behind thick walls of protection. He thanks me once his gear is all handed through the door, and the patrol officer locks the cell again. They head back out almost immediately to continue their own searches, and I finally get back to the station to continue with my own shift. Other than a couple more hours of shouting insults back and forth, the night went by without anything else to really share. Whilst Cakeman was initially painful, it can be forgiven, put down to a direct result of him being attacked. I don't know why he was jumped, but listening to the way he was yelling abuse at the Murray North inmates, it wasn't that difficult to guess. Monday, January 29th. I came in expecting to head back into Goulburn West, but instead found myself reallocated into Murray North. Whilst definitely the least favorite of all the night units to sit in, tonight was a little different because I wasn't the main officer in the unit. Normally, that unit was run by a single officer, alone to sit in the station and deal with whatever shit was thrown at him. But tonight, I was asked to stay in there and help out, because there were 3 S1s, as well as a number of management regime prisoners. While S1 inmates needed a visual check every 15 minutes, which then had to be noted on the S1 log sheet, management prisoners were very similar to S3s, except they weren't on suicide watch. They still needed to be visually checked every hour throughout the night, but they had all their belongings in their cell. Management regime watches were normally prisoners that had been transferred into Murray that very day. The regime was meant to ensure they were adjusting to life inside a management unit, which, for some, was quite hard to take. Sitting in the driver's seat was an officer that began his career at the same time I did, with us sharing the same intake class. I've known Will for many years, and don't mind spending the night listening to his war stories. This is, after all, his assigned unit. He waits until the day shift have left the unit before asking me to look after the S1s, if that's okay. I don't mind, as he has enough things on his plate to keep him busy throughout the night. Apart from watching the management crooks, he will update musters, plus dive into his own file notes and interactions that he still needs to complete. I check the S1s and find all three simply lying in their respective bunks, with two fast asleep, while the third is staring at the ceiling with a vacant expression. Two of the three are new into the prison, and getting put on an S-watch, or suicide watch, is a great way to keep from being transferred into the mainstream units, particularly if you're scared to go. When I go back and read the suicide logs for each prisoner, I find that one is in for making child pornography and immediately understand his hesitation to be sent through to his protection unit. Obviously, protection doesn't really mean protection, not for him anyway. It simply means he's allocated to a unit with other sex offenders and crooks too scared to go to the prison population. The weird thing about protection units is that even sex offenders have certain limits within their ranks. It's weird, I know. Apart from conducting the necessary checks, Will and I catch up on each other's lives. It has been a while since we've seen each other, and it's good to catch up with him. He shares some significant life events that have happened to him, including the loss of his mother, someone who played a substantial role in his life. I listen with interest and offer him my sincerest condolences for his loss. It saddens me to hear his pain, but unfortunately cannot relate when it comes to parental love. I had a shit upbringing, living my entire childhood constantly in the shadows of a narcissistic father who made my life hell. Regular beatings, constant degrading, and an endless lineup of chores were the daily ritual for my siblings and I, and it didn't leave a happy taste in my mouth. Will tells me about his own children, and that part I do relate with and thus listen with enthusiasm. It's strange to have one's emotions so mixed and varied from one subject matter to the next, but I guess it's how life goes for us. The intercom buzzes just before midnight, and it's one of the management crooks needing medical help. Will goes to the trap and listens as the occupant explains his need for a particular medication. Rather than call a code, Will calls the soup instead and gets authorization to have the nurse escorted up. It's almost an hour before the nurse eventually shows up, but she dispenses the tablet and we watch the crook swallow it, then shut the trap and return to our previous post. Sometimes things just run smoothly and don't make for interesting reading. Whilst the night may not be as volatile as others, it is far from boring. The suicide watches, management regime prisoners, and Will's own filing requirements keep us a lot more busy than would normally be the case. Our only positive from all this is that most of the prisoners leave us alone for the most part, holding conversations amongst themselves instead. Because it was quite a warm night, it may have helped with keeping the majority of the unit quiet, perhaps most too tired to stay awake. The airflow through Murray North is quite poor, and it leaves a stuffy atmosphere for the occupants, us included. While Will continues on with his file notes, I begin the normal round of breakfast duties around 5 that morning, starting with getting the trolleys ready, switching on the industrial toaster, and prepping the cutlery. As I start running loaf after loaf of bread through the toaster, Will takes over the S1s, giving me the freedom to prepare the breakfast rounds. It takes almost an hour to get everything finished, and if he had been by himself, would have been a nightmare to finish alone. But good teamwork normally leads to successful outcomes, and we start to hand out breakfast plates precisely on time. Each trap I open is met by a "Morning, boss," and it's the perfect way to finish the month. It's only another hour after we hand out the last of the breakfast plates that the shift finally comes to an end and I happily hand over my keys and radio to control on my way out. It has been an interesting month, as well as a very sad one. Losing a friend and fellow officer is never easy, and my hopes and prayers go out to Roland's family. Whilst it may be the end of this month, I know there's another one waiting for me just around the corner, and with it, all the unpredictability I've come to expect from this place. After the crazy situations I've already witnessed, I shudder at the prospect of those that lie ahead. They couldn't get any worse, could they?